what is Stoicism?
Oh, starting with the big question.
Yes.
Well, well, I think it's a framework for understanding your life, your position in life, your relationships with other people, with yourself, with the wider world. And it really just helps us make sense of who we are and what we're supposed to do while we're here.
And why is Stoicism seeing a revival now? If
Oh,
yes, why?
yeah. I mean, a couple of reasons. I think it's obviously a complex phenomenon, right? But I think partly because of the decline of traditional religion as a source of morality for a great number of people, right? I mean, there's no question that attendance at traditional religious services has decreased in recent decades and things like that. So I think that certainly plays a role. Also, the times that we live in are so crazy and there's so much change, constant change. And, a lot of people feel like there's a decline in Western culture. People are really looking for guidance to make sense of everything that's going on. It's interesting because some things, human nature stays constant, right? So we can look back to the ancient Greeks and Romans and the times that they were going through as well. But things are also different. Society has a different structure today. So we're constantly, I think, revisiting old ideas to make something new for ourselves. So I think that's what modern Stoicism is.
And so, how does Stoicism help with these problems?
Well, it provides this framework. So if we go back to understanding the relationship between ourselves and others, how are we supposed to interact with people? I know you're interested in community, right? And interacting with other people. So for example, Stoicism gives us a way of doing this. And Stoicism says, well, we're not in this alone, right? We are part of the larger group. This is our natural state, right? I think the individualistic idea that it's like, oh, I should only look out for myself has become more prevalent. And so Stoicism is a counter to that and says, no, wait a minute, that's not going to work. You're going to be miserable. Everybody else is going to be miserable. This isn't the way to a healthy, flourishing society or healthy, flourishing individuals, because it's in our nature to care about other people and join forces with other people and build these communities. And so anytime we don't do that, we're going to be unhappy. And, I think we're seeing this borne out in the mental health crisis going on. Obviously, the pandemic has added a whole new dimension to that. But, even pre-pandemic, I think that was the direction that kind of the mindset was going. So Stoicism is kind of a corrective to the every man for himself idea, right?
And so, how did you come to Stoicism?
Well, kind of like probably most other people, I was at kind of a crossroads in my life, kind of going through a crisis. I had just left my career, which was a very big thing. Many of us these days are so invested in our careers as a source of identity and fulfillment. And so that was a huge, psychological blow. Basically, I had to figure out how to come to terms with myself, not as, having that career. At the same time, we had moved to a new city. I didn't really have any family and friends. It was a very different sort of place than I had been used to before. I was responsible for taking care of my three energetic young children, during the day. So it was really a lot of things kind of came together, and I didn't know where to turn. I looked into some different things. I think a lot of people probably are interested in secular Buddhism and kind of travel in that direction, but that didn't really work so well for me. So I kept looking. And one day I just went on Amazon and typed in wisdom, books on wisdom, and fortunately came across William Irvin's book, A Guide to the Good Life. And, it's intriguing, right? What does Stoicism have to do with a good life? And then looking at other titles, the connections between Stoicism and happiness. So it's like, whoa, what's going on here? So I clicked, I read my first book, and, then I just kept going. And the more I read, the more sense it made. It's counterintuitive, right? That you would become happy by becoming virtuous. by becoming an excellent person and developing your character. It's kind of counterintuitive, and it's definitely not something we encounter very often in our society these days. And yet, once you start looking at the world through that framework, and once you start trying it out for yourself and putting it into practice, it makes complete sense. And, all the pieces fall into place. And you can feel for yourself if it works or not, right? That's the wonderful thing about Stoicism being a philosophy of life, a practical philosophy, is that we can try it out for ourselves. If it doesn't work, we move on to something else. But I found, and so many other people have found, and this is the reason for the flourishing revival of Stoicism, right? Is because it does work. It really fits all the pieces of human nature and what's going on in the world. It all fits them together, and it works.
So what would you recommend for somebody who is just starting out looking into Stoicism?
I recommend the same books that a lot of other people recommend. William Irvin's A Guide to the Good Life is excellent. I think he starts with the assumption that why would anyone be interested in this in the first place? So he really goes back to square one and explains why you need a life philosophy in the first place and why Stoicism in particular is a good one. So he's very convincing in this. Donald Robertson's Stoicism and the Art of Happiness is excellent. He lays out very clearly a lot of the key Stoic doctrines. I still go back to his book and see, okay, does this really make sense, what I'm saying? So those would be good. Massimo Pigliucci's How to Be a Stoic, excellent. And of course, there are a lot of new ones as well. I think Ward Farnsworth's A Practicing Stoic is really good. And once you kind of get a handle on a modern interpretation of Stoicism, then definitely you have to go back to the original texts. I tend to recommend starting with the modern first, because otherwise, if you just sit down and read the meditations, some of it isn't going to make sense as much as it will if you already have the framework in mind. Excuse me. So I would say start with a modern or two, and then go back to the ancients and read all the ancient works, because each of the ancient Stoics has their own kind of take on things, way of seeing things, and it just presents a complete picture of Stoicism, I think.
So what is the state of Stoicism today? What's going on with the Stoic movement today?
Exciting things are happening, I think. I think 2021, well, so the pandemic kind of gave us the opportunity to really come together, I think, as an online community in a way that we weren't doing pre-pandemic, because it forced everyone to do everything online. And as I'm sure you know, well, you're in Toronto, so I think there's a really vibrant Stoic community there. For a lot of others, you might be the only person in your community for miles around who has even heard of Stoicism, right? So there's not a lot of opportunity for interaction in your community. And so that's the case for me. So going online enables us to connect with people who have a similar interest wherever. So I think 2021 has kind of given us an opportunity to connect with people in a new way. And one outcome that I'm particularly happy with is the involvement of so many more women, right? So earlier this year in June, we hosted the first StoiConX Women called Practical Paths to Flourishing. And we had over 500 attendees. We've had many more people view it online. It's now open to everyone to view. And it's just really exciting to see, how women have been able to kind of make it our own, also while recognizing that Stoicism is for everyone. So that's kind of one example. People with more specialized interests are able to come together in a way that we wouldn't have before. I've also put together with Eve Riches a site called stoicare.com. So this is just one example of how people are applying Stoicism more to special interests and in specific communities. So stoicare.com is for people who are caregivers in any capacity, pretty much. So that would be teachers, parents, healthcare workers, psychotherapists, counselors, mentors, pretty much anyone who is in a caring position. And we're showing how Stoicism can really be beneficial in that capacity. So I think, not just the overall Stoic community, but the ability of people with kind of more specialized interests within the Stoic community to come together. I think that's really exciting.
Um, kind of touching on those specialized interests. Um, is there anything that you feel is misunderstood about Stoicism and that you'd like to set the record straight about?
Well, that's partly what I was doing in my Stoicon talk, which was called How Do Stoics Care? And I know you said you saw it. I can just describe it for people who didn't, if you'd like. So there is a lingering stereotype out there that Stoics don't care about things in general, and especially not other people. And this is, I think, because Stoicism kind of disappeared for a while and didn't have any active practitioners in a recognizable way. It's always been kind of an undercurrent in Western thought. It's there if you look for it, but it wasn't really visible because of, the history of Western society and Christianity and these things. But so I think people didn't get a chance to see Stoics in real life. And so just reading the Stoic texts, there are passages that could be misinterpreted as, oh, you shouldn't care about people. For example, when Epictetus says, remind yourself that your wife or your child is mortal, and that way, if they pass away, you won't be upset. So if you have no acquaintance with Stoicism and you just read that line out of context, it sounds pretty horrifying. What? I'm not supposed to care about my wife or child. When in reality, that's not what it's talking about at all. So as I explained in my Stoicon presentation, Epictetus is trying to help us detach our happiness from other people while reminding us that it is up to us to care about them, right? So part of our human nature, which the Stoics absolutely took for granted and incorporated into the very fabric of the philosophy, is that we care about other people. This is part of our nature. And Epictetus even says, if you have a child, it is no longer in your power to not care about the child. It's accepted as a given of human nature that we will care about other people. And so when he says to remind yourself that your child is mortal, he's teaching us how to deal with that fact of life, that our child is mortal. And instead of pretending like that fact isn't true and denying the fact and trying to push it out of our minds, we embrace it, we accept it. And in doing so, we learn how to care wisely. We care truly in a true way, understanding that our child is mortal and still loving them, right? So I think there's this, very big understanding out there that Stoicism is about getting rid of all your emotions. And that's not true. It's learning how to perfect your emotions.
And what do you mean by perfect your emotions?
Well, we can look at the idea of the Stoic sage. So the ancient Stoics often turn to this idea of the sage as the perfect person, right? The ideal wise person. And it might sound kind of strange to hold up this example that none of us can ever actually become, right? Because they didn't say that we are going to become a sage. And in fact, they argued that the sage might not ever really exist. There were some mixed opinions. Maybe the sage just doesn't exist. Maybe he or she is very rare and comes about once every 500 years. But in any case, it's not something that most of us will be able to achieve. And interestingly, the founders and the heads of the ancient Stoa did not consider themselves sages, which is super interesting. Um, but they still found value in looking at this ideal because it gives us a direction. So, if we want to aspire towards something, towards happiness and fulfilling our nature, we need to know what that actually looks like. And so that ideal would be perfection. So if we want to become happy, if we want to become excellent and flourish, then we would try to perfect our nature. And that involves making the correct judgments about what's important in life, making correct judgments about what's appropriate for us to do, understanding our relative position in the world compared to other people, compared to nature as a whole. So all of these things go into, creating who we are and resulting in inner transformation. So I think that answered your question, right?
Yeah. Um, what what's your favorite part of Stoicism?
I mean, the Stoic answer is that it's all connected. You can't really do one part of Stoicism without another. So I'm not sure I can answer that, other than to
What,
say that I love how practical it is. You know, it's not something that you can merely sit around and read about. You know, you have to put it into practice. I think someone who just read about it and didn't try it would not understand what it's really about. So again, that goes back into part of the misunderstandings over the centuries. If you're not actually trying to live it, then it doesn't make nearly as much sense as when you're in that position, you use the strategies, you see that it does result in a happier life and a better life. And then you're like, oh, okay, that's why they said that. Now it makes sense. You know, so I guess I just love how practical it is.
what's your favorite effect of Stoicism on your life?
Um, I mean, just in general, happiness, I guess that's kind of a vague term. But of course, when the Stoics say happiness, they're talking about eudaimonia, which was the ancient Greek idea of flourishing, right? Of a lasting and steady happiness, or you could call it a mental state, right? So when I look at where I was before I came across Stoicism, you know, when I was describing this period of my life, I was a mess, right? So I didn't know what I wanted. I didn't know what I should do. I had a sense that I needed to be responsible for my children. You know, when you become a parent, then all of a sudden it's not just about you, right? And finding your path, then you have to help your children as well. So that's something that Stoicism has done. It's a compass, right? It helps us orient ourselves in this difficult life.
Can Stoicism, um, let me rephrase that. Um, do you see Stoicism playing a role in our society, in our larger society moving forward?
That's an interesting question, and I hope so. There are signs that it might be. For example, there was an article in Vice magazine earlier this year, um, and the author suggested, I think I'll paraphrase here. She said it's 10 years ago, Stoicism was in the lecture room, and now it's come out of the lecture room and is for the masses. So the fact that someone in Vice is writing that, you know, it tends to make me think that maybe it's going that direction. If that's what they're seeing, it can be hard to tell from inside the community what other people are seeing. So that was really interesting. So I don't know. You never know for sure, but I do hope that we can make it more and more part of the cultural conversation.
If it was, what effect do you think it would have?
Well, I think it kind of depends on which level of stoicism or what type of stoicism the masses would embrace. You know, there's definitely a strand of stoicism that's life hack oriented, right? Where you're just trying to use stoic techniques for yourself to benefit yourself. There's also a strand that's kind of connected to productivity and business success, right? And, you know, while Stoicism doesn't necessarily see anything wrong with that, it's not the reason for Stoicism, right? So if you think that that's the point of Stoicism is to become more commercially successful or materially successful, then that's not it, right? You haven't gotten it. So I think that the actual success of Stoicism depends on how well people can understand that it's about virtue, right? It's not about life hacks or commercial success. So I think it'll be important to, you know, like you're doing, really emphasize the more compassionate and community oriented aspects as a corrective to those kind of life hack ideas.